Will you pray with me? Holy One, I begin with the same prayer I offer before I preach, that you once again let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our collective hearts simply be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Friends, I just want to clarify where we are in the lectionary calendar. We haven't really changed our elements this morning, but they are supposed to be green, so we're in ordinary time. We'll get that done before next Sunday, right? We can do that. The birthday of the church was last week, and so we begin nearly 6 months of ordinary time, not meaning boring ordinary, but chronologically ordinal time, a set of stories narrating Jesus' life. This year, selected from the Gospel of Luke. And from kind of a 10,000, 20,000 feet look back, a Christian year, it seems divided almost in half, about 6 months of holy seasons, Advent, Epiphany, Lent, Eastertide, and about 6 months of this ordinary time. And if my friend Robin was here, I think we could talk about this particular text that we're going to talk about today and how we were both kind of baby Baptists and we heard it. Ooh, maybe you, Gabrielle. How we heard it growing up, right? This demon possession, right? And how the Gerasene, the demoniac, was healed. We probably heard healings in other ways, right? And this "be still my soul," right? Be still my soul, your best, your heavenly friend, through thorny ways leads to a peaceful end. It was preached to me that you'd be healed of the thorny ways. And it's not how I'm going to preach it today. We still have these thorny ways that we're going to get to traverse, right? And I think there was potentially some spiritual malpractice happening in my childhood. I don't know if they didn't know any better. But that if I held on to Jesus hard enough, I'd be healed of whatever, addiction, mental illness, trauma, abuse. If I just had enough faith in Jesus, but the demoniac saw it and it was healed out of him. And I don't know that that's fair, right? Because how many folks have all this faith? In fact, probably more faith than I do. I doubt sometimes. How many of us find ourselves doubting? We're disciples, of course, right? You get to doubt. The disciples doubted. They had the head doubter in chief, right? Well, let's get to the scripture today. So Jesus has been traveling the countryside, healing, teaching, and the biggest thing was raising the dead. And in effect, manifesting this new era, right? The Great Jubilee, which I missed out on yesterday. I decided to stay home and work on my sermon instead of going to the Poor People's Campaign for a lot of reasons. There were kind of a whole bunch of protests happening all at once. We had Roe v. Wade protesting, we had the gun lobbyists and the gun rights folks lobbying at the same time yesterday, and we had the Poor People's Campaign. And I thought, I'm going to stay at home and participate virtually with all of them. So that is the Great Jubilee that Jesus is preaching about, but 2,000 years ago. And here we are. So we've got our own new era happening right now. And the atmosphere of this week's passage is full of both amazement and fear. I can kind of identify. So Jesus has just single-handedly calmed a storm on the Sea of Galilee and then admonished his disciples for a lack of trust in Luke 8:22 through 25. So they come ashore and Jesus immediately encounters in Gerasene a man possessed by demons. And again, I'm amazed kind of the timeliness of this text, just as all of this is happening in our own capital in DC, just as there has been consensus between parties on gun reform, which some people say is not enough, some people say is too much. I'm just amazed that something is happening. I think it's a really kind of beautiful thing. We are about to finally come back to Frederick for Pride, which I think is a wonderful, beautiful thing after 2 years. Releasing some of our own demons of sorts, right? Consensus is the releasing of demons, right? And we may have to face some people's demons, you know, with Pride. I know that I've seen on some message boards that there are going to be some protests of that, so that'll be fun. That happens at every Pride, though, so I'm not surprised, right? Jesus has been traveling the countryside, and he's going to face some resistance. Go figure, right? For Luke and his contemporaries, the world is riddled with demons who distort creation, and they overwhelm hearts and minds. Human beings are cast as porous creatures, open to spiritual influence. So that's mental illness is kind of cast as demons in this. We know that from Job. We know that, you know, all the time here. Jesus himself is filled with the Holy Spirit. We know this from Luke 4, and many are possessed by unholy ones. Is kind of how they write this. On first glance, of course, the way of understanding the world can seem archaic and foreign if we look at this text, but it's not, you know, it's not so unlike our world. There are still kind of revivals where we see this kind of thing happening. But on the contrary, any number of death-dealing forces can be experienced as possession or being caught up in dynamics that exceed our own levels of control. Think of how addiction looks this way or overwhelms us and families, how racism kind of shape shifts over time between explicit and implicit forms, how anger consumes us, how envy devours us in a moment, how sexism creates pervasive cultures of degradation. Now, we may or may not, I think it's problematic to call addiction or racism demons, but we can think about it in this way. They move through the world as though they're cunning, right? They seem to resist and sometimes co-opt attempts to overcome. And as we make those attempts, the experience can be less like figuring out an equation and more like wrestling with a beast of sorts, specifically when we talk about systematic issues, right? So one of Luke's goals in this story is to underline God's power over a death-dealing force in our lives, no matter how invincible they may appear at first, right? We don't know how long this person has been struggling with this legion. But the story's other driving theme is just as important. It's the healing and liberating central theme to Jesus' mission. The man begins, what? Unhoused, right? In a tomb, naked, isolated, and shackled, living among the tombs. And therefore, he's perpetually unclean and out of his right mind. And by the story's end, he's welcomed back. He's clothed. He's now unchained. And he's in his right mind, sitting at Jesus' own feet. He goes from outcast to an insider, from a pariah to an apostle, without a home to feeling very right about. And in their conversation, it's ambiguous whether the man speaks to Jesus or whether the demons are speaking through him to Jesus. So the man and his demons have become virtually indistinguishable. Now, I know this from speaking to folks throughout my career with unhoused folks, or even with the folks when we were feeding the hungry. You don't always know who you're speaking to, right? Jesus asks him his name, and what does he say? Legion. Now, this is interesting because it's a term that simultaneously signals his fragmented chaotic state, and it alludes to the Roman Empire, where legion was meant as 6,000 soldiers. So we may not know this as readers just glancing at the text, but anyone in that time frame would have known what that signified. And the man is not so much possessed, but occupied. And his fractured, subdued condition mirrors the situation of the land and of the people of the Roman occupation. So it's really interesting. And it signifies the time and the place. It's like a time stamp. So the demons, or the legion, immediately recognized Jesus' authority. And they beg what? To be spared. They want to stay. That's their home, in that man, in that body. They're embodied. They don't want to be banished or destroyed. And Jesus grants their wish, giving them permission to leave the man and enter a nearby herd of swine. What's Jesus up to here? The answer lies in what happens next. And they plunge themselves into the sea. The demons vividly demonstrate the self-defeating, self-destructive essence of those death-dealing forces. They destroy themselves. And all this is too much for the Gerasene townspeople. They're terrified. And they insist that Jesus leave all at once. It's interesting when townspeople find liberation to be too much. And we see that all the time, when liberated folks are too much to witness. And for his part, the healed and liberated man asks what? His first ask is to follow Jesus, not to stay. He wants to go with Jesus. But then as Jesus asks him, he stays and becomes an apostle to the Gentiles in his very own city. In a glimpse of the kind of early Christian thinking that eventually gave rise to the doctrine of the Trinity, Luke tells the story this way. Jesus tells the man to declare how much God has done for you. And the man promptly sets out to declare how much Jesus has done for him. In Jesus, Luke implies we come face to face with God. So Jesus' ministry involves both risk and adventure. Not for its own sake, but for the sake of the health and life of the world. And so this week, we get to challenge ourselves, both as individuals and as a church. How do we boldly and effectively stand against those forces in our own world, in ourselves, and in our own communities? Are we following that same spirit? Are we willing to venture out into unfamiliar shores? I mean, I'm not going to Gerasene, right? I don't know that I've struggled with demonic forces. But I think that I am drawn to outcasts. And I think that we're kind of an interesting group of folks, right? If we look around. And I think that we're working towards making communities whole. Jesus' mission has a particular shape and direction towards healing and liberation. We're not just called to proclaim that mission, right? But to advance it. This 180-year-old church, right? If we just sat idly, and get to hear Gail talk about the invitation to theater camp to a child with a wheelchair, right? How does our church meet that need? When he says, follow me into the storm, into the shadows, into the storms themselves, he means follow me into the good and difficult work, building from the ruins, giving people dignity. What does that look like? Giving people third and fourth helpings, but wait till someone has had a first helping, right? Giving folks dignity, right? The work of salvation in our hearts and our homes and our neighborhoods, the good news of the gospel is that life-giving mission that is already underway, and God calls us to take part in that beautiful struggle of restoration. I don't know what next weekend's gonna look like, and I don't think we do yet either, right? Post-COVID, during COVID, you know, we're not really post-COVID, we're not really post-race, we're not really post, you know, we're working on all those things. So what are the things that Jesus is calling this historical, open and affirming church working on racial reconciliation to do and to be? And I think we're still answering those questions. And what are our demons that we internally have to face to go out in the world and work on those things? What are the things that we need to be liberated from that allow us to go into the world and work? What are the things that keep us from living into our own call? How can we ask for release from those things that hold us captive and gain new life, right? And freedom. It takes boldness. It takes radical faith. And friends, we have a history of both radical faith and boldness. Amen.